A proud African woman gave a hungry boy food, not knowing his father was Korea's most feared mafia boss. He didn't knock. He didn't call out, didn't scan the room for someone in charge. He simply stepped through the doorway of the small Lagos-owned restaurant and stopped, small and still, like his legs had carried him as far as they were willing to go, and this was where they had decided to rest. Kofi Kelechi looked up from the stove. She had been in Seoul long enough to stop being surprised by most things. The language that lived in her mouth now, not perfectly, but enough. The landlord who never smiled but always fixed things. The market women who had slowly, over months, stopped treating her like a visitor and started saving her the good tomatoes. She had learned this city the way you learn a difficult person, carefully, with patience, without taking anything personally. But she had never seen anything quite like this. The boy was maybe 9 years old. School uniform, pressed, polished, exact. The kind of neatness that tells you someone in his life cared very much about appearances. His backpack straps were gripped in both fists, not loosely, not nervously, held. The way you hold something when everything else has already slipped. His eyes moved around the restaurant the way a much older person's would. Quiet, deliberate, deciding. Kofi wiped her hands on her apron and stepped closer.
괜찮아요? She asked gently.
You okay? The boy looked at her. His eyes were calm. Too calm for 9 years old. Too steady for a child standing alone in a stranger's restaurant in the middle of a school day. He said nothing for a moment. Long enough that the silence had weight. Then quietly,
배고파요.
I'm hungry.
That was all. No story attached to it. No explanation offered. Just the truth, placed on the table between them like something fragile he had been carrying for a while and was finally setting down. Kofi nodded once. Sit, she said. She pulled out a chair and tilted her head toward it the way you do when you've already made up your mind. He crossed the room without hesitating. Set his backpack beside the chair with a precision that felt practiced. Not taught, practiced. Sat down straight, hands folded, like he was here for something important and intended to behave accordingly. Kofi almost smiled. She moved quickly. Hot stew ladled into a bowl, steam rising in a slow curl, the rich aroma filling the narrow space between them. Rice, side dishes, all of it placed in front of him without ceremony. No questions. No pity. No performance of generosity. Just food. The boy looked at the bowl, then at her. Something shifted in his face. Too brief to name, gone before she could study it. He picked up his spoon and began to eat. Not fast, careful, measured in a way that made Kofi's chest do something quiet and complicated. She went back to wiping the counter, watching without staring. The old chef worked quietly in the back, the low clatter of his work a familiar sound. The smell of fermented paste and something sweet from the pot on the stove settling over the room like weather. What's your name? Kofi asked after a while. A pause. Kyung-soo, he said.
I'm Kofi.
He nodded once, like he was filing it somewhere important. Outside, the rain had begun, soft against the windows, the kind of rain that makes small spaces feel warmer than they are. For a moment, the restaurant existed in a kind of stillness. Just the rain, just the boy eating, just Kofi watching someone be, briefly, safe. Then she noticed his shoes, polished to a shine that didn't belong on this street. His uniform crest, small, embroidered, unmistakably expensive. His posture, not the posture of a boy who had never known discipline. The posture of one who had been taught that discipline was survival. Something isn't right. She refilled his water, said nothing. He had almost finished when his eyes drifted to the window and stayed there. Kofi followed his gaze. 3 black cars had stopped outside. Identical, expensive, unhurried, the kind of cars that didn't need to rush because everything simply waited for them. Kyung-soo's hand tightened around his spoon. Not dramatically, not visibly if you weren't watching. But Kofi was always watching. His shoulders didn't move. His face didn't change. But something behind his eyes went quiet, the way things go quiet right before they stop being quiet. Like he had been counting down to this moment. Like some part of him had hoped the count would last longer. The restaurant door opened, And Kofi Kelechi's entire understanding of that afternoon, of that boy, of that bowl of stew, of the simple act of feeding someone who was hungry, changed forever. If this story is already pulling at something in your chest, hit that subscribe button right now, because what walked through that door next is only the beginning. And where this goes, you are not prepared. The man who stepped inside was not loud. He didn't need to be tall, composed, dark suit, tailored so precisely it looked less like clothing and more like a statement. His face was angular and completely still, not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of someone who had long ago decided that revealing nothing was the safest way to move through the world. His eyes swept the room exactly once. Quick, precise, missing nothing. 3 men followed without being told. Positioned themselves, door, window, the far wall, automatic, practiced, like breathing was something they'd also been trained to do correctly. The temperature in the room changed. The old chef in the back, who had worked that kitchen every day for 11 years, who had survived Seoul's worst winters and his own worst memories and never once let a pot boil over, went completely still. And Kofi straightened. She didn't know why. She only knew that every instinct she had, everyone sharpened by growing up in a crowded Lagos household where silence meant pay attention, everyone refined by years of reading a foreign city just to survive it, was speaking to her now. Loudly, the man's gaze swept the room, then landed on the boy, on Kyung-soo. But to understand what happened next, to understand what Kofi did and why and what it would cost her, you have to understand who Kofi Kelechi was before that afternoon. Before the restaurant. Before Seoul. Before a 9-year-old boy walked through her door and changed the direction of her life without saying a single word to cause it. You have to go back to the beginning. But that beginning would have to wait. Because outside, the cars had arrived. 3 of them. Black. Identical. Moving without urgency, the kind of vehicles that understood that the world adjusted to them, not the other way around. They didn't screech. Didn't rush. They simply materialized at the curb like a fact that had always been true and was only now making itself visible. Kofi noticed them through the window. Then she noticed Kyung-soo. He hadn't moved, hadn't turned around. But his hands, those small, careful hands that had held his spoon with such deliberate calm, had found his backpack straps again. Holding them, the way he had when he first walked in. Holding on. His face didn't change. His posture didn't collapse. But something behind his eyes shut down, quietly, efficiently, like a door being closed from the inside by someone who had done it many times before and no longer needed to think about it. 8 seconds passed. Then the restaurant door opened, and the air changed. The man who stepped through was not what Kofi had expected, though she could not have told you in that moment what she had expected. He was tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit so precisely fitted it looked less like clothing and more like intention. His face was angular, unreadable, and completely still. Not peaceful. Controlled. There is a difference. Peace is something you arrive at. Control is something you maintain. At cost, at effort, at the daily decision to reveal nothing that could ever be used against you. This man had been making that decision for a very long time. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. 3 men followed him in. No signal given, no words exchanged. They simply positioned themselves, door, window, far wall, automatic and precise, like extensions of a single decision already made elsewhere. The old chef in the back went still. Kofi straightened. The man's eyes swept the room once. Unhurried, exact, and landed on Kyung-soo. Something moved across his face. Relief. So brief, so quickly buried, that if Kofi had blinked she would have missed it entirely. He crossed the room in measured steps and crouched beside the boy, checking him the way you check something precious that has been out of your sight too long. Shoulders, face, hands, still whole, still safe. Kyung-soo looked up at him. No fear, just the quiet recognition of someone returning to where they were always expected. They spoke low, too low for Kofi to catch. Then Kyung-soo turned and pointed at her. The man's gaze shifted, landed on Kofi with the same precision it had swept the room, except this time it stayed. Kofi did not look away. She wasn't sure why. Pride, maybe. The same stubbornness that had carried her from Lagos to Seoul with nothing but a plan and the refusal to be small. Whatever it was, She held his gaze the way she had always held difficult things. Steadily, without apology. The silence stretched. Then he reached into his coat and placed something on the table. An envelope. Thick. Heavy. The kind that didn't need to be opened to communicate its meaning. Kofi didn't touch it. Didn't look down. I fed him, she said simply. 3 words. No performance behind them.
No negotiation.
Just the plain truth of what had happened and the implicit refusal to let it become anything else. The man studied her. Not dismissively. Not coldly. Carefully. Like she was something he hadn't encountered before, and wasn't entirely sure what category to place her in. Then he nodded. Once. He took Kyung-soo's hand. They turned. And within moments, without ceremony, without a word to the room, they were gone. The cars pulled away as quietly as they had arrived. The restaurant exhaled. Kofi stood alone in the stillness, the envelope on the table in front of her, the rain still soft against the glass. She picked it up, opened it, and the number inside made her set it back down on the table and simply stare at it, because that wasn't payment. That was a message. And messages like that, from men like that, never arrived without something following close behind. She didn't search the name immediately. She cleaned first, wiped down the tables, stacked the chairs, rinsed the bowl Kyung-soo had eaten from and set it on the drying rack with the same care she gave everything in this kitchen. Routine was something Kofi trusted. It had carried her through harder nights than this. Nights in Lagos when the plan fell apart. Nights in Seoul when the loneliness sat on her chest like something physical. Keep moving. Keep your hands busy. Feelings could wait until the work was done. But the envelope sat on the counter. And the name sat in her mind. Kang Min-kyu. At 11:30, she typed it into her phone. The first results were nothing. A board member listing. A charity donation. A photograph at some industry gala, the man in the background slightly out of frame, as if even cameras couldn't quite hold him directly. She scrolled further. Then further still. And the picture that assembled itself. Slowly, piece by piece, the way dangerous things reveal themselves, was not the picture of a businessman. Forums that spoke in careful language, the kind people use when they are not entirely sure who is reading. References to an organization with no official name and no official structure, only reach long, quiet, and absolute. Journalists who had begun investigating and then, without explanation, stopped. A politician photographed leaving a building he had publicly denied ever entering. Supply chains that existed on paper and meant something else entirely underneath. Kofi set her phone face down on the table. Picked it up again. Kang Min-kyu did not appear in headlines. He appeared in the spaces between headlines, in what wasn't said, what wasn't published, what wasn't pursued. He was not the kind of powerful that needed a press release. He was the kind that made press releases unnecessary. Feared, someone had written in a buried comment thread, was not quite the right word. Feared implied uncertainty about what he might do. With Kang Min-kyu, there was no uncertainty. Kofi put the phone down again and stared at the ceiling. And then, quietly, without meaning to, she thought about the boy. The way Kyung-soo had sat. Back straight, hands folded. The manners of someone raised inside a world where being watched was constant and every movement carried consequence. The way he had eaten. Not hungrily, not desperately, but carefully. Controlled even in hunger. Even at 9 years old. The way he hadn't told her anything. Not his school. Not his neighborhood. Not why he was alone. Children told you things. They complained. They explained themselves. They filled silence instinctively because silence made them uncomfortable. Kyung-soo had sat inside the silence like he had been living there for years. Because he had. Of course he had. And then, the thing that kept returning, the detail she could not file away and leave alone. He had turned and pointed at her. Not at the food. Her. Why? She was a stranger. A Nigerian woman running a small restaurant on the wrong side of Seoul's attention. She had done nothing remarkable. She had simply fed him without asking who he was or why he was alone or what he needed beyond what he had already said. Was that it? Was that genuinely all it had taken? Kofi turned off the kitchen light. Told herself the strange afternoon was over. That the envelope, still sitting on the counter, still unopened a second time, as if looking at it again might make it more real, was simply money from a man who paid for things because it was the only language he trusted. She told herself that. She almost believed it. But as she lay in the dark, staring at nothing, the question stayed with her, small and patient, and unwilling to be dismissed. Why did he point at you? She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But somewhere beneath the unease, beneath the careful practicality she had built her whole life around, something quieter was already forming. The feeling that the afternoon wasn't over, that it had, in fact, barely begun. He arrived 3 days later. Kofi was restocking the side shelf when the door opened, and something about the way it opened made her look up before the bell had finished ringing. Not urgency, not aggression, just a particular quality of entrance, deliberate and unhurried, that she was beginning to recognize as the signature of people connected to Kong Minkyu. The man was older, 60s perhaps, silver at his temples, a charcoal suit with the quiet expense of something that would never need to announce itself. He carried nothing except a slim folder and the kind of stillness that came not from calm but from absolute certainty about why he was here. He stopped at the nearest table. Miss Kofi. Not a question, not quite a greeting, simply an acknowledgement that she was the person he had come for and the matter of finding her had already been resolved. I represent Mr. Kong, he said. Kofi set down the jar she was holding. Slowly, deliberately. I figured, she said. He placed the folder on the table and took a step back. Not deferential but precise, giving her space to look without pressure. She didn't touch it. Mr. Kang's son, the man said, has made a request. A brief pause. He does not make requests often. Something moved through her chest at that. She kept her face still. He has asked for you specifically, the man continued. Not a tutor, not a nanny, not a household appointment. He said each word as though separating them carefully. You, the woman from the restaurant, the one who fed him. Kofi crossed her arms. What exactly is being proposed? A place in Mr. Kang's residence. To guide Kyung-soo. To be present in the way that... He paused, selecting his words with visible care. Certain adults need to be present for certain children. Someone steady. Someone who sees clearly. His eyes held hers. Someone who fed him without asking who he was. I'm not interested, Kofi said. The words came quickly, reflex, instinct, the automatic response of a woman who had built everything she had with her own hands and had learned, at significant cost, what happened when you let other people's worlds swallow yours. The man nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. You would be compensated generously, he said. Your restaurant would be maintained in your absence. All arrangements handled. Then, after a brief pause, and you would be protected. That word landed differently from the rest. Protected. Kofi kept her expression neutral, but her mind had already caught it, was already turning it over. Protected from what? Protected how? And the fact that it was offered at all, quietly, matter-of-factly, as though it were simply a standard term of arrangement, told her more about the world she was being invited into than anything else he had said. I'll think about it, she said. The man nodded once, left the folder on the table, and walked out without another word. The door closed behind him with the same quiet precision with which it had opened. Kofi stood in the silence. She didn't open the folder immediately. Instead, she stood at the window and watched the street. Ordinary, unhurried, entirely unaware that anything had shifted. But it had. She knew it had, because she was already thinking about Kyung-soo. Not the cars. Not the envelope. Not the name that had kept her awake for 3 nights. Just the boy. The way his shoulders had carried something they shouldn't have. The way he had eaten carefully, like even hunger required discipline. The way he had looked at her when it was over, before his father arrived, before everything changed. Like she was somewhere safe. Like that was something he hadn't found in a while. Kofi picked up the folder, opened it, read it, set it down, and stood very still for a long moment, because she already knew what she was going to do, and knowing it frightened her far less than it should have. The house was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something dramatic. Gates that announced themselves, architecture designed to intimidate, The visible language of power made stone and steel. What she found instead was worse. The mansion sat behind walls that were high but not ostentatious, at the end of a private road that didn't appear on any map she had checked. It was beautiful in the way certain silences are beautiful, complete, precise, and entirely unwilling to make you comfortable inside it. A staff member met her at the entrance. Polite, efficient, eyes that assessed her position and filed their conclusion somewhere behind a professional expression. She was shown to her quarters, larger than her entire apartment, overlooking a garden that was immaculate and somehow joyless. Every hedge trimmed to an angle that suggested nature here was also expected to behave. Kofi unpacked slowly, set her things on surfaces that felt borrowed, looked out the window at the gray morning light and told herself, firmly, that she had made a considered decision and would honor it. Then she went to find the boy. Kyung-soo's daily schedule was printed and laminated. She found it on the desk in his study, a room that smelled like new books and contained no drawings, no scattered toys, no evidence of the ordinary chaos of a 9-year-old's interior life. Mandarin at 7. Mathematics at 8:30. Classical piano at 11. 3 approved leisure activities, listed in order of preference, each with a time allocation. The boy himself sat at his desk when she entered, back straight, working. He looked up when she came in, and for a moment something moved behind his eyes, quick and carefully managed, like a light turned on and then immediately reconsidered. "Miss Kofi," he said. Formal. Correct. The way he had been taught to greet adults. "Just Kofi," she said, and sat down across from him like she had been doing it for years. The staff didn't know what to do with her. She wasn't a tutor, there were already 2 of those. She wasn't a housekeeper. She didn't wear a uniform or carry a schedule. She occupied a category the household had no existing language for, and that absence of category quietly unsettled people whose entire function depended on knowing exactly where everyone stood. Kofi noticed, said nothing, moved through the house with the same steady unhurriedness she moved through everything. The shift in Kyung-soo happened on the 4th day. She had brought ingredients from the kitchen, unauthorized technically, and arrived at his study after his afternoon lessons with the quiet announcement that they were going to cook. Not a lesson, not a scheduled activity, just something they were going to do because she felt like it and she thought he might too. He stared at her. "That is not on my schedule," he said carefully. "I know," Kofi said, and began spreading ingredients on the low table. He watched her for a long moment. Then he got up and joined her. She taught him to make the stew, the real version, the one her mother had made in Lagos with the windows fogged from heat and someone always arguing in the next room. She talked while she worked, easy and unhurried, about nothing important, about the market, about bad weather, about the time she had badly mistranslated something in a Korean grocery store and bought 3 times more ginger than any human being could use. Kyung-soo listened, and then, briefly, almost accidentally, he laughed. A small sound, quickly recovered. His hand actually moved toward his mouth as if to catch it. But it had already happened. Kofi kept talking, pretending she hadn't noticed, giving him the privacy of the moment. But something had loosened in the room. Some wire that had been pulled too tight for too long had, for just a second, gone slack. She didn't see Kang Min-kyu until that evening. He was on the upper landing when she crossed the entrance hall below, still hands clasped behind his back, watching the space she had just moved through. Not the door. Not the boy's study. Her. Kofi didn't look up, but she felt it. The particular quality of attention from a man who had spent years watching everything and trusting nothing, now directing itself, quietly and with great focus, toward her. She kept walking, and made a private note that in this house, everything had eyes, including the man at the top of the stairs who was only now beginning to understand what, exactly, he had let through his door. It happened in small pieces. That was the only way Kyung-soo knew how to give anything, carefully, incrementally, the way you might test ice before committing your full weight to it. A sentence here, a question there. The slow, cautious extension of something that had been kept folded for so long it had forgotten its original shape. Kofi didn't push. She had grown up in a house where silence was information, where you learned to read the room before you read the words. You didn't drag things out of people, you made enough space that they eventually walked out on their own. So she cooked. She talked about nothing important. She let him watch before she let him participate. And she waited. The first real thing he told her came on a Tuesday. They were in the kitchen, again unauthorized, again quietly tolerated by the staff who had stopped trying to categorize her, and Kyung-soo was attempting to dice an onion with the focused intensity he brought to everything. Too much pressure. Too determined to do it correctly on the first attempt. You're gripping it like it owes you something, Kofi said. He looked up. Something almost like indignation crossed his face. My piano teacher says precision requires pressure. Your piano teacher, Kofi said, is not cooking. A pause. Then, I have 6 hours of lessons on Saturdays. She looked at him. 6. He returned to the onion. Father says discipline at this age determines everything later. Delivered flatly. The way you repeat something you have heard so many times it has lost its meaning entirely and become simply a fact of weather. Kofi said nothing for a moment. What do you want to do on Saturdays? She asked. The question appeared to confuse him. Not because he didn't understand it, but because no one had ever directed it at him before. She watched him search himself for an answer and find mostly silence where one should have been. The silence of a child who had been so thoroughly scheduled that wanting had quietly stopped feeling like an available option. I don't know, he said finally. Honest in the way children are honest when they're too tired to construct an alternative. Kofi nodded. That's all right. We can figure it out. She told him about Lagos. Not formally, not as a lesson, but the way stories come out naturally when your hands are busy and the kitchen smells like something good. About the noise of it, the color, the specific chaos of a household with too many people and not enough space and somehow always enough food. About her mother, who cooked like it was argument and prayer happening simultaneously. About the way everyone knew everyone's business and nobody apologized for it. Kyung-soo listened with his entire body. It sounds loud, he said. Extremely, Kofi agreed. I don't like loud, he said carefully. Then, after a pause, but that kind sounds different. She looked at him. It sounds like people, he said. Simply, without self-pity. And that sentence stayed with her the rest of the evening. The quiet devastation of a 9-year-old distinguishing between noise and presence. Because he had grown up with one and not the other. She started small, teaching him to taste things before measuring them. To trust his instincts before his instructions. Letting him make mistakes in the kitchen without consequence. Something so foreign to him that the first time she said, "That's fine, we'll fix it." He looked at her like she had said something in a language he was only beginning to learn. He started finishing her sentences. Started arriving in the kitchen before she asked. Started talking. Not reporting, not reciting, but talking. Filling silences with observations, questions, the ordinary commentary of a child who was slowly remembering that the world was interesting and he was allowed to find it so. The laugh came back. Not just once now. Small, controlled still, always slightly surprised by itself. But returning, like something that had been locked in a room and was now cautiously testing the door. Kang Min-kyu noticed. She knew because the household had its own atmosphere, and that atmosphere had shifted. A tension she couldn't name but could feel. The particular quality of a powerful man reconsidering something he thought he had already understood. She saw him once, in the hallway outside the kitchen, paused mid-step. Listening to his son laugh at something she had said. He didn't enter, didn't interrupt. He stood there for a moment, still unreadable the way he always was, and then continued walking without a word. But his pace had changed. Something in it had slowed, just slightly, like a man adjusting to a new piece of information and not yet certain what to do with it. That night, Kofi sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her hands. She had come here for the boy. She had told herself that clearly, kept it simple. Do the work. Stay herself. Don't get tangled in what surrounded it. But somewhere between the onions and the Lego stories and the small, careful laugh that Kyung-soo kept catching like it surprised him every time, she had stopped being someone doing a job. And the difference frightened her. Not because she wanted to leave, but because she was beginning to understand that she didn't. The first sign was the guard rotation. Kofi noticed it on a Wednesday morning. The men at the outer gate changed shifts 2 hours earlier than usual. For instead of 2, their positioning tightened, their conversations reduced to nothing. She noticed because she noticed everything, and because in this house, changes in pattern were the only language that told the truth. She said nothing, filed it away. By Thursday, there were cars she didn't recognize parked on the private road. Not close enough to breach anything, close enough to make a point. That evening, Kyung-soo's outdoor time was quietly cancelled. No explanation offered. His schedule simply appeared the next morning with that hour removed, replaced with an indoor music session that nobody had requested. He noticed too. She could see it in the way he sat at breakfast, eating with his usual precision but his eyes moving, just slightly, toward the window with a frequency that had nothing to do with the view. "Kyung-soo," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Eat," she said. Just that. He did. But the window kept pulling at him. She learned what was happening the way she learned most things in this house. Not from being told, but from paying attention to what everyone was carefully not saying. A rival organization. A dispute over territory or authority, or the kind of thing that powerful men fought over when the real subject was simply power itself. She caught fragments. A conversation stopped when she entered a room, a name spoken by one of the senior staff and then immediately swallowed, the controlled urgency of men who had been trained to manage danger and were now managing something at the edge of what training could handle. And Kyung-soo, she understood, was not incidental to this. He was the point. It happened on a Friday afternoon. She was walking with him in the interior courtyard, one of the few outdoor spaces still permitted, when the sound came. Not an explosion. Not gunfire. Something sharper and closer. A vehicle accelerating where no vehicle should have been. A commotion at the outer wall. Shouting in the clipped, controlled language of men reacting to something that had already happened before they could stop it. One of the bodyguards reached them in seconds. Not to explain. To move them. Kofi grabbed Kyung-soo's hand without thinking. He didn't pull away. He moved with her. Fast, silent, no panic. The terrible composure of a child who had clearly rehearsed this moment in his head many times and had simply been waiting for it to become real. They were placed in an interior room. Door secured. 2 guards outside. Kofi sat on the floor with her back against the wall, breathing steadily, keeping her face arranged into something that would not add to what the boy was already carrying. Kyung-soo sat beside her. Closer than he usually allowed. The sounds outside were muffled, then distant, then gone. Neither of them spoke. Then, after a long silence, Kyung-soo said, "Are you going to leave?" Flat, careful. The question of someone who has watched people make that calculation before and has learned not to show how much the answer matters. Kofi looked at him. "No," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned, slightly, almost imperceptibly, until his shoulder was resting against her arm. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Later, when the house had settled and Kyung-soo was asleep and the guards had resumed their rotations with that particular silence that follows contained danger, Kofi stood at the window of her room and finally let herself feel it. The fear she had managed through, not around. Her hands were steady. They had been steady the whole time because he needed them to be. But now, alone, she let herself register what the afternoon had actually been. How close the edge had been. What protected had always really meant. Spoken in this house. By these people in this life. Not comfort. A warning. She had known, intellectually, what she had walked into. She had read the name. She had seen the cars, the guards, the envelope full of power dressed as money. But knowing a thing and feeling it were different countries. And today she had crossed the border. She thought about leaving. Ran the thought through seriously. Gave it a full and honest examination. The restaurant, her apartment, the ordinary life that was still technically hers if she chose to return to it. Then she thought about a 9-year-old boy asking, "Are you going to leave?" in a voice stripped of everything except the effort not to care about the answer. Kofi closed the curtain and stayed. It began the way dangerous things often do. Quietly. A Tuesday morning. Kyung-soo's Mandarin tutor arrived 12 minutes late. Unusual but not impossible. The substitute driver who brought him offered a brief explanation to the gate. Plausible. Documented. The kind of detail that would only seem wrong in retrospect, once everything else had already happened. Kofi was in the kitchen when she heard the change in the house. Not a sound exactly. More an absence of the right sounds. The specific silence that falls when people who are paid to be alert suddenly become very alert all at once. She was moving toward the corridor before she had consciously decided to. She heard Kyung-soo before she saw him. Not a scream. He wasn't the kind of child who screamed. It was something quieter and therefore worse. A single sharp word in Korean, cut off abruptly, from the direction of the east wing where his morning lessons were held. Kofi ran. The door to the study was open. The tutor was gone. One of the regular guards was on the floor breathing but down. And there were two men she had never seen in this house moving toward Kyung-soo, who had backed himself against the far wall and stood there with his hands at his sides and his face absolutely closed, giving them nothing, the way he had been trained to give nothing. But his eyes, when they found hers across the room, his eyes were terrified. Kofi didn't think. She stepped through the door. "Hey!" Both men turned. She held their attention the way she held everything. Steadily, without flinching, her body positioned between them and the boy with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had already made their decision and was done deliberating. "Get away from him," she said. One of them said something in Korean she didn't fully catch. Dismissive. Amused, almost. She was a woman. She was in the way. She was, by every calculation they had made entering this room, not a serious problem. They had miscalculated. She didn't have a weapon. Didn't have training in the formal sense. What she had was the particular fearlessness of someone who had already identified the only thing in the room that mattered and had decided, with complete clarity, that she was not moving away from it. She bought enough time. The guards arrived within seconds. Alerted, converging, the house's defense mechanisms finally catching up to what had already begun. The two men were contained quickly, efficiently, with the practiced speed of people for whom this was not the first time. And then Kang Min-kyu was in the doorway. He took in the room the way he always took in rooms. Instantly, completely. The guard on the floor. The two men now restrained. His son against the wall. And Kofi, standing in the middle of it. Breathing hard but steady. Unharmed. Unmoving. Something crossed his face that she had not seen there before. He crossed the room toward Kyung-soo. And Kyung-soo, who had held himself completely together through all of it, who had not cried, not collapsed, not made a single sound beyond that one brief word, looked past his father. Kofi, just her name, said the way you say the name of the thing you were holding onto the entire time. She was beside him before his father could speak, crouching to his level, her hand on his shoulder, and he folded just slightly, the way a child folds when they finally reach the person they were trying to reach, the composure coming apart in one quiet exhale. She held him. Kang Min-kyu stood 2 feet away and watched. The threat was neutralized. The house secured. Reports made in the clipped, efficient language of men managing aftermath. None of it touched the corner of the room where a 9-year-old boy was finally, briefly, just a 9-year-old boy, and the woman holding him was exactly where she had decided to be. Kang Min-kyu didn't leave. He stood at the edge of it, this man who moved through the world like weather, who had never needed to reconsider anything because he had already considered everything. And reconsidered. Kofi looked up once and found him watching her with an expression that had no name in the vocabulary he usually carried. Not gratitude exactly. Not calculation. Something unguarded. Something, she thought, that surprised even him. She looked back at Kyung-soo. And the room held all of it. The danger now past, the fear now releasing, and something else entirely just beginning. In the particular silence that only comes after the thing you were most afraid of finally stops. Everything had changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. The way real things change, quietly and all at once and with no going back. The house was quieter after. Not empty, it was never empty, but quieter in the way places become quiet after something significant has moved through them. The staff spoke in lower registers. The guard rotations tightened without announcement. And somewhere beneath the ordinary sounds of a large household resuming its rhythms, there was the particular stillness of people who understood that something had shifted and were waiting to learn what it meant for them. Kofi understood the feeling. She was waiting too. Kang Min-kyu came to her the following evening. No representative this time. No folder placed on a table. He came himself, appearing in the doorway of the small sitting room adjacent to the kitchen, the room that had quietly become hers over the past weeks, and stopped there with his hands clasped behind his back. "May I?" he said. The question appeared to cost him something. Not much, but something. Kofi looked up from her tea, studied him for a moment. "Sit," she said. He did, across from her. And for the first time since she had entered this house, Kang Min-kyu occupied a space without commanding it. He simply sat, like a man who had arrived somewhere with something to say and was taking a moment to find the right way to say it. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. That surprised her. "I have been watching you," he said finally. "I know," Kofi said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Recognition, maybe. "I watch everyone," he said. "It tells me what I need to know. Who people are when they think no one is paying attention." He paused. "You are the same person regardless of who is in the room." Kofi held her tea, said nothing. "I find that," he said carefully, "extremely rare." She looked at him directly. "Is this where you tell me you trust me?" "Yes," he said, without deflection, without the layered language of a man accustomed to never saying the plain thing. Just, yes. "I trust almost no one," he continued. "That is not a personal failing. It is an accurate assessment of my circumstances." A pause. "But I trust you. I trusted you before I understood why. Kyung-soo understood before I did." Kofi set her cup down. "What are you offering?" she asked. "Not employment," he said. The same words his representative had used, but weighted differently now, coming from him directly. "A position. In this house. In his life." He met her eyes. "In decisions that concern him. Your judgment. Your presence. Your—" he paused, selecting the word carefully. "Yourself. Exactly as you are." "I'm a Nigerian woman who runs a small restaurant," Kofi said. "You are a woman who stood between my son and danger without a second thought," he said. "The restaurant is incidental." Kofi was quiet for a long moment. She thought about everything that had brought her to this room. Lagos, the decision to leave. Seoul arriving hard and asking nothing. The small restaurant built from stubbornness and time. A boy who walked through her door holding his backpack straps like they were the last solid thing. She hadn't come here looking for any of this. But she had learned, over the years, that the life you build and the life that finds you are often two different things. And the wisdom was in knowing which one to choose when they finally stood in the same room. "I don't submit to arrangements," she said. "I enter them on my own terms." Kang Min-kyu held her gaze. "I know," he said. "That is why I'm asking." She found Kyung-soo the next morning in the kitchen. He had gotten there before her, ingredients already pulled from the shelf, the cutting board positioned, his apron tied with the slightly too careful knot of someone still learning. He looked up when she entered, and smiled. Not the small, caught-by-surprise expression she had been filing away for weeks. Not the brief, quickly recovered flicker that he always seemed to apologize for with his eyes. A real one, full and unhurried. The smile of a child who had remembered, or perhaps discovered for the first time, that smiling was simply something you did when you felt like it and the room was safe enough to let it show. Kofi stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she tied on her own apron and joined him. The day she fed a hungry boy who didn't ask. She didn't know she was changing his life. She didn't know she was stepping into a world that would test everything she was made of. She didn't know that a single act of dignity, quiet, uncalculated, asking nothing in return, would shift the balance of something far larger than a bowl of stew in a small restaurant on an ordinary afternoon. But that is the nature of certain moments. They don't announce themselves. They simply arrive. And the woman who answers the door changes everything. If you enjoyed the story this far, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next chapter and enjoy more story from us. And if this story gave you chills, drop a like and share it with someone who loves powerful romance with a dangerous edge. Your support keeps these stories coming. Thank you.